The billionaire's wheelchair-bound son hadn't smiled since the accident, but that evening, the poor nanny convinced him to look at the sun, and the impossible happened. He laughed. The click of the camera echoed like a miracle, until the millionaire appeared at the door, saw the scene, and what he did left her speechless. The wrought iron gate opened with a slow, majestic groan, a sound that to Arthur Monroe felt less like a welcome and more like the ceiling of a crypt. He maneuvered the German sedan across the cobblestone courtyard, where the afternoon silence seemed a physical entity, heavy and oppressive. His mind was still immersed in numbers, in the market fluctuations that comprised his vast fortune, in the cash flow of his businesses that spanned continents. It had been a day of significant gains, a considerable increase to his already robust net worth, but the sense of victory dissolved the moment he passed through those walls. Here, dollars and euros lost their sheen, transformed into mere colored paper before the grey reality that awaited him. Before he could even turn off the engine, his hand hovering over the ignition, something stopped him. A faint sound, almost a whisper on the air, but unmistakable. Laughter. A melody that hadn't echoed here in 3 years, not since Helen had gone and taken all the world's colors with her. Arthur frowned, the crease between his eyebrows deepening. He stepped out of the car, his designer coat feeling like useless armor against the sudden vulnerability that assaulted him. He walked slowly, following the source of the voices that seemed to be desecrating the house's sacred grief. That's when he saw her, or rather, he saw them, his son, Leo, sitting in his wheelchair, his usually pale and listless face now bathed in the golden light of dusk, and he was smiling. Not a twitch, not a shadow of joy, but a genuine, open smile that reached his eyes and seemed to ignite an inner light Arthur had thought extinguished forever. Kneeling before him on the cold stone ground was the new nanny, a young woman of simple appearance whose name he barely remembered reading on the contract. She was holding an old instant camera, an almost anachronistic object in this technological age, and in a soft voice she was saying, "Look toward the sun, Leo. Let it kiss your face." The scene paralyzed him. The air around him seemed to change temperature, suddenly becoming more breathable. What he was witnessing wasn't just an employee doing her job, nor a child being momentarily distracted from his pain. It was something deeper, more elemental. He, a man who had built an empire from nothing, who understood the value of every asset and the complexity of every investment, felt utterly ignorant. All his money, all his wealth accumulated in gold, in crypto, in investment funds, hadn't been able to buy a single one of those smiles. The woman, with her cheap camera and modest clothes, had achieved in a few days what the best doctors and therapists in the country had failed to do in years. She had found a crack in the darkness and, with a simple gesture, flooded it with light. The soft click of the camera's shutter sounded like a thunderclap in the silence of his soul, the sound of something breaking within him. Arthur remained motionless, hidden by the shadow of an old magnolia tree, his heart beating out of rhythm. He watched her show the small instant photo to Leo, and the boy laughed again, a sound so pure and crystalline it wounded him with an unbearable sweetness. It was a miracle, a small, inexplicable miracle blooming in the sterile garden of his life. A wave of relief washed over him, so intense it nearly buckled his knees. But then, right behind it, came the familiar chill of fear, the silent partner in his entire existence. He had learned the hard way that life was a balance sheet of profits and losses, a brutal stock market of emotions where happiness was the most volatile asset. And moments like this, so pure and perfect, always came with a footnote written in fine print, but miracles, he had learned, came at a price. Clara felt his presence before she saw him. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if the air had grown denser, charged with a contained electricity. Leo's smile faltered for an instant, and his eyes, previously fixed on the small photograph developing in his hands, drifted to a point over her shoulder. Clara turned slowly, her heart skipping a beat. Arthur Munro stood there, a statue in a dark suit against the green of the garden, his face an indecipherable mask from which it was impossible to guess any emotion. The magical moment, woven from light and laughter, dissolved like smoke. She stood up, brushing invisible dust from her knees, the old camera suddenly feeling as heavy in her hand as a stolen object. He said nothing, simply walked to his son, and the brief moment his hand rested on Leo's shoulder was fraught with an awkward, almost painful tenderness. He dismissed her with a nearly imperceptible nod, a gesture that put her back in her place, an employee, an anonymous cog in the machinery of his vast and complicated life, someone whose performance was evaluated like the return on another one of his financial instruments. In the days that followed, Clara learned to navigate the silent corridors of the mansion, which felt more like a museum to a life that no longer existed. Every object seemed untouchable, every closed door guarded a secret. Her biggest obstacle, however, wasn't her absent employer, but the constant, watchful presence of Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a woman with an impeccable bun and a steel-like gaze, who had served the family for decades and moved through the house with the authority of a guardian of sacred relics. Mrs. Gable had made the rules clear from the first day, with a cutting politeness that was more intimidating than any shout. The boy needed routine, not distractions. Meals were served punctually. The home's common areas were restricted, and above all, the past was not to be disturbed. "Mr. Munro values order and discretion," she had said, her eyes fixed on Clara's. "Any disruption to the delicate equilibrium of this house will be unwelcome." It was a veiled threat. The first of many. Clara, however, carried a resilient sweetness within her. She had learned to find beauty where pain insisted on living, an instinct that photography had taught her. Her first act of rebellion was small, almost invisible. Leo's room existed in a perpetual twilight, the heavy velvet curtains always drawn, as if to shield the boy from the world outside. One morning, while Leo stared blankly at a tablet screen, Clara walked to the window. "You know, Leo," she began, her voice soft, "they say a little morning sun helps manufacture joy. What do you think about testing that theory?" The boy didn't answer, shrinking further into himself, but she didn't give up. She pulled the fabric open just a crack, and a beam of golden light sliced through the room, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Leo blinked, annoyed. The next day, she opened the curtain a little wider, and the day after, wider still, until, by the end of the week, the room was flooded with morning light, revealing the faded colors of a wallpaper with little airplanes, a vestige of an interrupted childhood. That afternoon, while Leo was napping, Clara found herself drawn to the music room, a space Mrs. Gable made a point of keeping locked. The door, however, was merely ajar. She slipped inside, her heart beating a little faster. In the center, covered by a white dust sheet, was a grand piano. Moved by an impulse, she lifted a corner of the fabric. The ivory keys, yellowed with time, seemed to sigh. Her fingers hovered over them, hesitating. She knew she was crossing a line, breaking one of the unwritten rules of this place. But the sight of the silenced instrument, like the boy in the next room, pained her soul. It was then that Mrs. Gable's voice sounded behind her, cold as a blade of ice, making her jump. "Some things are best left sleeping, miss." For everyone's sake, Mrs. Gable's reprimand hung in the air, heavier than the sheet on the piano. Clara stepped back, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks, a mix of shame and defiance. "I was just," she began, but the housekeeper cut her off with a curt wave of her hand. "I know exactly what you were doing. You were trying to wake ghosts. This house has enough of its own." With that, Mrs. Gable ushered her out of the room. And the sound of the key turning in the lock felt final, a full stop to her audacity. The episode served to highlight the silent conflict between the two women. Mrs. Gable saw Clara not as a threat to her job, but to something much deeper, the painfully constructed order built upon the ruins of a family. The housekeeper was the personification of loyalty to her employer, a loyalty that manifested in preserving the status quo, in maintaining the cocoon of silence that, in her view, protected Arthur from his pain. The arrival of this young woman, with her unorthodox methods and her gaze that seemed to see through walls, was a disturbance in the mansion's fragile ecosystem. Arthur, for his part, observed from a distance. He had built his immense fortune on analyzing patterns, on the ability to predict market moves before they happened, and he saw a pattern forming here, inside his own home. He noticed the light that now flooded his son's room, the low sound of conversations that sometimes leaked into the hallway, the way Leo seemed less hunched in his chair. He treated Clara with a professional, almost cold distance, a way to maintain control over a situation that made him uncomfortable. She was just another investment in his portfolio of expenses, an item on his spreadsheet of liabilities, and he couldn't allow emotions to interfere with his decisions. But at night, in the silence of his office, while analyzing stock market charts and crypto prices, his mind would drift. He would catch himself remembering the sound of his son's laughter, a memory that was both a balm and a torment. The piano, however, had planted a seed. Days later, Clara found Leo parked in his wheelchair in front of the music room door. He said nothing, just touched the dark wood with his fingertips. "Your mother played, didn't she?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Leo nodded, his eyes downcast. "She played a song about the sea. She said the black keys were the rocks and the white ones were the foam on the waves." The revelation, so simple and so heavy with longing, gave Clara the courage she needed. She wouldn't confront Mrs. Gable, but she would find another way. That afternoon, using her modest smartphone, she looked up the melody he had described. She found it. In the following days, she began to hum the tune softly while they were in the garden, or when she helped him with his exercises. At first, Leo pretended not to hear. Then, his fingers started to drum on the arm of his chair, following the rhythm. One rainy afternoon, when the world outside seemed as grey as the inside of the house, Clara sat beside him with a small toy keyboard she had found forgotten in a closet. "How about we create our own sea song?" she proposed. Leo looked at her suspiciously, but curiosity won out over his apprehension. She played a simple note. "This can be a raindrop falling into the ocean." He, hesitantly, reached out a finger and pressed another key. A slightly off-key sound filled the silence. "And that," he said, his voice fragile, "is a seashell hiding in the sand." They continued like that, note by note, building an imperfect, hesitant melody. Arthur, passing by in the hall, stopped when he heard the sound. It wasn't Helen's piano, not the perfection he remembered. It was something new, fragile, and uncertain. He stood there, hidden by the half-open door, his heart tight with an emotion he couldn't name. It was the first time he had heard music in that house in 3 years, and the sound, while it hurt, also began to heal a wound he didn't even know was still bleeding. The sound of that toy keyboard continued to echo in Arthur's mind long after it had stopped. It was a disconcerting counterpoint to the calculated silence of his life. He was a man who measured success in dividends, in rising net worth, in assets that multiplied while he slept. His life was a fortress built with the capital of discipline and control. Yet, the simplicity of that scene, the nanny and his son creating a fragile melody, exposed a poverty in his existence that no fortune could disguise. He felt a pang of something akin to envy, not of their happiness, but of the ease with which they found it. He, the multi-millionaire, surrounded by every comfort money could buy, felt like a spectator looking through a shop window at a warmth he couldn't reach. This new dynamic, this lightness that Clara was introducing into the mansion's somber corridors, began to disturb him, to challenge the order he had fought so hard to maintain. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, also noticed the change. She saw the growing bond between Clara and Leo not as progress, but as a usurpation. In her mind, loyalty to her employer meant protecting Helen's memory, and every one of Leo's smiles in Clara's presence was a small betrayal of his absent mother's image. Her comments became more acidic, her criticisms more frequent, always disguised as concern. "The boy needs structure, not fantasies," she would say to Arthur, her voice heavy with a protective zeal. "This girl is encouraging him to live in a world that isn't his. That could be dangerous." Mrs. Gable's words were seeds of doubt planted in soil already fertile with Arthur's fear and guilt. He found himself torn. One part of him, the logical, business-minded part, agreed with the housekeeper. Stability was crucial. But another part, the exhausted father who had seen a glimmer of light in his son's eyes, hesitated. Photography, however, remained Clara and Leo's secret language. She had taught him to see the world through a lens, to find frames in the banality of everyday life. They photographed raindrops on the window pane, the texture of tree bark, the way the afternoon light spilled across a Persian rug. They were small acts of discovery, a way of remapping Leo's limited territory, transforming the mansion from a prison into a universe of possibilities. One day, while organizing some old books in the library, a room that smelled of dust and time, Clara found something hidden in the back of a drawer. It was an old family album, bound in dark leather, with the initials of Arthur and Helen embossed in faded gold. She hesitated, feeling the weight of the forbidden relic. She knew it was another of the doors Mrs. Gable preferred to keep locked, but curiosity and an intuition that there might be a key within was stronger. She took the album to Leo. Together, sitting on the sunlit floor by the window, they began to turn the pages. The photos told the story of a time that seemed to belong to another dimension. Arthur smiling, his eyes bright with the look of a man in love. Helen, beautiful and vibrant, playing the piano. Running on a beach, hugging a small Leo who was still steady on his own 2 feet. The boy stared at the images in silence, his finger tracing the outline of his mother's smiling face. Suddenly, he stopped on one particular photo. Helen at the wheel of Arthur's convertible, her hair blowing in the wind, looking at the camera with infectious joy. Leo's eyes filled with tears, and he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. A wish so large and so impossible, it made Clara's heart stop for an instant. "I wish I had a picture in Dad's car, so it would look like Mom is still looking at me." Leo's request reverberated in the silence of the library, a wish so pure and laden with pain that it defied all the logic and rules of the house. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at the photograph of Helen, at the joy frozen in time, and then at the boy beside her, a prisoner of his own longing. Anyone else would have dismissed the request as a childish fantasy, an impossible dream. But Clara saw beyond that. She understood this wasn't a wish about a car, but about connection, about the desperate need to feel his mother's presence, even if only through a recreated image. It was a cry for help disguised as a dream, and she couldn't ignore it. She knew the risks. Mrs. Gable's fury, the probable disapproval of Arthur, a man whose obsessive control extended to every corner of his estate, especially his collection of luxury cars, kept in the garage like jewels in a vault. Over the next 2 days, an audacious idea began to take shape in her mind. She observed the house's routine, Arthur's schedule, Mrs. Gable's comings and goings. The plan was risky, bordering on insubordination, but the image of Leo's pleading face wouldn't leave her. She had learned to heal with small gestures. And this one too, though logistically complex, was essentially just that, a small gesture to mend a broken heart. On a Thursday afternoon, when Arthur was in a long board meeting and Mrs. Gable had left to run personal errands, Clara saw her window of opportunity. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she went to Leo. "Remember your wish?" she asked, her voice steady to mask her nervousness. "I think today is a good day for the sea, even if it's a sea of asphalt." Leo's eyes lit up with a mixture of astonishment and hope. Together, they executed the plan. The hardest part was the ramp. Using a few wooden planks she found in the pool house, Clara improvised an unsteady incline leading from the side door to the garage. It was a huge physical effort, and several times she thought she wouldn't make it, but the boy's determination, watching her with silent expectation, gave her strength. Then came the clothes. Leo chose a light blue linen shirt, which Clara recognized from the photo album. It was hers, he said, touching the fabric with reverence. Dressed, he seemed older, his pale face gaining a solemn dignity. Pushing the wheelchair up the makeshift ramp was an act of sheer willpower. Finally, they were inside the garage. The smell of leather and gasoline hung in the air. There, under a fabric cover, was the silver convertible, a sleeping beast. With a joint effort, they managed to transfer Leo to the passenger seat. He sank into the soft leather, his small hands flat on the dashboard, his eyes scanning every detail as if he were in a sacred place. Clara ran to the other side, opened the driver's door, but didn't sit. The afternoon light, filtered through the high garage windows, created an almost heavenly effect, bathing the car in a golden glow. "Ready?" she asked, raising the old camera. Leo looked straight ahead at the imaginary road, and then a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was a smile that held the memory of his mother, the pain of her absence, and the fragile joy of this stolen moment. "Ready," he whispered. The light was perfect. The moment was everything. She focused the lens, and it was at that exact instant, as the soft click of the camera was about to immortalize the scene, that the sound of another engine, Arthur's sedan, echoed from outside, followed by the familiar groan of the wrought iron gate opening. He was home, and everything was about to change. The sound of Arthur's approaching car was like a stone thrown into a placid lake, shattering the magical moment into 1,000 pieces. Icy panic shot up Clara's spine. She froze, the camera still aimed at Leo, whose smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of pure fear. The world seemed to move in slow motion. The sedan door opening, Arthur's expensive shoes on the courtyard stones, his firm, decisive steps approaching the garage. Clara had the impulse to hide, to try and undo what she had done, but it was too late. She was exposed, caught red-handed in her act of rebellion and tenderness. She lowered the camera slowly, its weight now crushing, and braced for the storm. She expected yelling, a summary dismissal. The fury of a man who saw his most precious assets, his son and his car, being used without his permission. Arthur stopped at the garage entrance, his dark silhouette framed against the blinding afternoon light. His eyes took a second to adjust to the dimness, and then he saw. He saw his son in the passenger seat of a car that hadn't been started in years. He saw the makeshift ramp, Helen's shirt on Leo, the nanny standing by the driver's door, her face pale and frightened. A series of emotions crossed his face, fast and indecipherable as stock tickers on a volatile day. Surprise, anger, confusion. The silence that fell was thick, charged with tension. Clara held her breath, waiting for the sentence. But the explosion never came. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Arthur's gaze fixed, not on her, but on his son. He saw the ghost of the smile that had vanished, the fleeting gleam of joy that still lingered in Leo's eyes. He saw his wife's shirt and, for a second, the memory of her at the wheel, laughing, was so vivid it stole his breath. The impact was silent, but profound, like a shockwave running through the foundations of his being. The wall he had built around his heart, brick by brick of guilt, fear, and control, developed a crack. The anger simmering inside him dissipated, replaced by an overwhelming and unfamiliar emotion, something that mixed pain with a searing gratitude. He didn't reprimand her. He didn't say a single word. He just walked slowly toward the car, the rigidity in his shoulders dissolving with each step. When Clara saw him approach, she lowered her head, mortified, expecting the worst. But he walked past her, his eyes locked on Leo. Arthur reached out and touched his son's shoulder, a gesture nearly identical to the one he'd made days before in the garden, but which now held a universe of different meaning. Then he raised his eyes to Clara. There was no fury in his gaze. There was only a raw vulnerability, and in his unblinking eyes, unshed tears glistened. It was a silent thank you, an acknowledgement worth more than any monetary bonus or formal praise. In that garage, amid the scent of leather and memories, an invisible exchange occurred. He, the billionaire who controlled empires, felt completely disarmed. She, the nanny who lived on a modest salary, realized her small act of courage had moved a mountain. The balance of power, so rigidly established by hierarchy and fortune, had irrevocably shifted. Leo, sensing the truce, looked from his father to Clara, and a small smile began to bloom on his lips again. The camera hadn't clicked. The photo was never taken. But the image of that instant, the father with his hand on his son's shoulder, the nanny with her heart in her hands, would be engraved in the memories of all three more clearly than any photograph. The silence was broken by Leo's trembling voice. "Dad!" he called out. "Can you push the chair? Clara's ramp isn't very good." Arthur blinked, as if waking from a trance, and for the first time in a very long time, a genuine, albeit weary, smile touched his lips. The incident in the garage was the epicenter of a silent earthquake that shook the mansion's emotional structure. In the days that followed, the climate began to transform in a subtle but undeniable way. The oppressive tension that had once hung in the corridors started to dissipate, giving way to an atmosphere of hesitant possibility. Arthur, for the first time in years, began to have breakfast with his son. They were short, awkward conversations, filled with long silences, but they were a start. He would sit at the table, pretending to read market reports on his tablet, but his eyes would constantly drift to Leo and Clara as they discussed what the photographic theme of the day would be. He watched them from a distance, intrigued, like an investor analyzing a promising but high-risk asset. There was a lightness between them that he didn't understand, and which he secretly feared. The more he tried to resist this new dynamic, the more Clara disarmed him with simple gestures, an apple spice cake whose scent transported him to his childhood, the sound of Leo's laughter coming from the garden, a small photograph taped to the stainless steel refrigerator door, the photo of the smile in the garden. Leo, once an isolated and apathetic boy, was blossoming with each day. Photography had given him a voice, a way to express himself and reconnect with the world. His father, who once saw only the wheelchair and the loss, was now beginning to see his son again, and in doing so, he felt a pang of envy. Not a destructive envy, but a healthy one for the courage of this woman who dared to find light where he could only see darkness. He realized that all his capital, all his businesses, were just ways of avoiding the real investment, the emotional one. He knew how to generate profit from stocks, but he had no idea how to cultivate happiness within his own home. Clara's presence confronted him with this personal bankruptcy, and it was both humiliating and strangely liberating. But this transformation did not go unnoticed by Mrs. Gable. The housekeeper saw the growing closeness between employer, son, and nanny as a dangerous breach of protocol, a direct threat to Helen's memory and her own position as guardian of the order. The loyalty she devoted to Arthur was possessive, and in her mind, Clara was an intruder who was not only occupying a space in the house, but also in the hearts of her charges. She decided to act. With the subtlety of a strategist, she began to plant new seeds of doubt. One evening, while serving Arthur his whiskey in the study, she commented, her voice laden with false concern, "Have you noticed how the new nanny seems overly attached? One must be careful. People of humble origins can sometimes get confused, see opportunities where there are none. An improper attachment could be detrimental to the boy." The words, carefully chosen, hit Arthur at his weakest point. The fear of being deceived, the suspicion that was the bedrock of his business empire. The suggestion that Clara's kindness might have ulterior motives, that his fortune was her true target, poisoned the fragile trust that was beginning to grow. Torn between what he felt and what his logic told him, he caved. The next day, he called Clara to his office. With a coldness that cost him immense effort, he laid down new rules. Her contact was to be strictly limited to Leo's care. Extracurricular activities, like photography, were to be curtailed. Meals would be taken separately. "We must maintain professionalism," he said, unable to look her in the eye. Clara listened in silence, the color draining from her face. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself, she just nodded. Her dignity, her only armor against the humiliation. The hurt in her eyes, however, was visible. And Leo, sensing the new distance, the return of silence and rules, closed himself off again, like a flower curling up at the first hint of winter. The light that had begun to shine in the house was suddenly extinguished, and the darkness, for a moment, seemed to have won the battle. The new order imposed by Arthur, under Mrs. Gable's influence, caused the mansion to regress to a state of coldness even deeper than before. The silence that settled was no longer passive, but active and heavy, a constant reminder of the newly created distance. Clara performed her duties with a robotic efficiency, the light in her eyes replaced by a contained sadness. She felt the injustice of the situation like a physical wound. Her only intention had been to heal, to bring a little color to a black and white world, but she had been judged and sentenced without a trial. Her deepest conflict, the feeling of not belonging in that world, now intensified. She was, after all, just the nanny, a disposable piece on the complex chessboard of the Monroe family's life. The pain of rejection was amplified by Leo's visible deterioration. The boy, deprived of the camaraderie and newfound joy, became a shadow of his former self once more. The curtains in his room were again half-drawn, and the small toy keyboard gathered dust in a corner. The change in the boy was a silent accusation that Arthur couldn't ignore. Days later, a summer thunderstorm broke over Connecticut, lashing the garden with torrential fury. Arthur was in his office, trying to focus on a report about the gold market, but his mind wandered. The sound of the rain reminded him of the day he'd first seen Clara in the garden. Moved by an impulse, he walked to the window, and then he saw her, huddled under the small roof of the pool house. She was trying to shield something with her own body. She was crying, not sobbing, but silent tears that mixed with the rain on her face. He felt a tightness in his chest, an uncomfortable sense of guilt. He went downstairs and, grabbing an umbrella, walked out to her. As he got closer, he saw what she was protecting so fiercely. The small photograph of Leo smiling, the one that had been on the refrigerator. The tape had given way in the humidity, and the photo had fallen, becoming partially soaked. The image of his son's smile was blurred, dissolving. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice sounding strange and inadequate in the middle of the storm. Clara started, quickly wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Yes, sir. I didn't want it to be ruined." She held the photo with an almost reverential care. "It's my favorite." The simplicity of that sentence, spoken with a disarming sincerity, hit Arthur with the force of a punch. He looked at the blurry image, at the trace of joy the water was erasing, and saw in it a reflection of everything he was doing. He was erasing the light, blurring the happiness. In an unthinking gesture, moved by a sudden need to fix what he had broken, he reached out and touched her arm. It wasn't an employer's touch, but a human one, hesitant and brief. "Let's go inside. We can try to dry it." The contact was electric. Clara flinched, surprised by the gesture. He also seemed surprised at himself, quickly retracting his hand. But the touch, however fleeting, had ignited something neither of them dared to name, a spark of connection in the midst of the storm, a tacit acknowledgement of each other's pain. Inside the house, in the silent, sterile kitchen, they worked together to save the little photo. They used a hairdryer on a low setting, their hands occasionally brushing in the process, each touch sending small shockwaves through them. The image was stained, imperfect, but Leo's smile, though a bit faded, was still there. Arthur looked at Clara, at the determination on her face, at the way she treated that simple photo like the most valuable treasure, and he realized, with a frightening clarity, that Mrs. Gable was wrong. This woman didn't see his fortune, she saw his son, and that, for a man who lived surrounded by people who only saw his money, was the most valuable and terrifying thing in the world. The little photo, saved from the rain, became a silent totem in the kitchen. Arthur, defying the rules he himself had imposed, put it back on the refrigerator door, this time secured with a small magnet. Mrs. Gable noted the gesture and correctly interpreted it as an act of defiance, a small fissure in her influence. The atmosphere in the house remained tense, but the dynamic had shifted again. The touch in the garden, though brief and never mentioned, created a new kind of awareness between Arthur and Clara. There was now a non-verbal understanding, an undercurrent of emotion that both tried to ignore, but which manifested in lingering glances and silences heavy with meaning. Arthur found himself watching her more closely, not with the suspicion of an employer, but with the curiosity of an intrigued man. He noticed the way she organized her few possessions, the passion with which she spoke about light and composition when she subtly tried to re-engage Leo in his photography lessons. One night, while researching new tech investment opportunities, his mind betrayed him, and he typed her name into a search engine. The results were scarce but revealing. He found Clara's old blog, abandoned for years. The posts were a mix of youthful reflections and amateur photographs of a surprising quality. There were soulful portraits of people in her neighborhood, urban landscapes that turned concrete into poetry, and photos of her mother, whom she described with moving love. In one of the last posts, she wrote enthusiastically about being accepted into a prestigious photography program with a partial scholarship. The next post, months later, was short and melancholic. She had to give up the opportunity to care for her mother, whose health had worsened. Arthur felt a pang in his chest. He, who saw life as a series of transactions and balance sheets, was suddenly confronted with the reality of a sacrifice made for love, not for profit. The discovery unsettled him. He saw the wasted talent, the dream deferred for duty. The next day, driven by a complex feeling of admiration and guilt, he tried to fix the problem the only way he knew how, with money. He called her to his office again. This time, his tone was different, almost awkward. "I've seen your work. You have talent," he said, getting straight to the point. "I would like to offer you the means to resume your studies. Consider it a bonus, an investment in your future." He expected gratitude, perhaps even tears of joy. Instead, Clara's reaction completely unnerved him. She listened, her face impassive, and when he finished, she shook her head gently. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Monroe. It's very generous, but I can't accept." Arthur frowned. "Why not? Isn't this what you wanted?" "Yes, it's what I wanted more than anything," she replied, her voice firm, though he could see the hurt in her eyes. "But I don't want it to be a gift. I want to earn my own way. I want to build something with my own hands, not with an employer's generosity. Money can buy a class, but it can't buy the feeling of achievement. The refusal was a blow to his ego and his worldview. He was used to his offers being accepted, to using his wealth to move pieces and solve problems. For the first time, someone was challenging him without fear, refusing the power of his millions. She didn't want his assets, his charity. She wanted dignity. That refusal touched him in a way no successful deal, no increase in his dividends ever had. And the bewilderment he felt was the beginning of a deep, genuine respect, something money most definitely could not buy. She was not a liability to be managed, but a human being with a strength he was beginning to profoundly envy. Clara's refusal to accept his money left Arthur in a state of deep reflection. He, a man accustomed to equating the world in terms of interest, profitability, and cash flow, was confronted by a logic his capital couldn't decipher. Her dignity was a non-negotiable asset, and it forced him to reevaluate not only his perception of her, but of himself. He began to realize that his life, for all its wealth, was emotionally insolvent. The respect he felt for her grew daily, morphing into a silent admiration that made the atmosphere in the house even more complex. The professional distance he tried to maintain was constantly sabotaged by this new perception. He found himself looking for her, waiting for the brief moments their paths crossed, just to exchange a glance that said more than any conversation. This fragile truce, however, was about to be shattered. Fate, like a ruthless trader on life's stock exchange, was preparing for a steep drop. The threat came in the form of Veronica, his former mother-in-law, a woman of New York high society whose elegance was as sharp as her tongue and whose family fortune rivaled Arthur's own. Veronica had never forgiven him for Helen's death, silently blaming him for not having been able to protect her. Her relationship with him was a cold formality, maintained only for the sake of her grandson, Leo, whom she saw as a project to be fixed. She appeared at the mansion unannounced on a sunny afternoon, bringing with her a gust of cold air that seemed to wither the flowers in the garden. Veronica observed the house's dynamics with a critical, penetrating eye. She saw the stained photo on the refrigerator, noticed the way Leo smiled at the nanny, and her disapproval was immediate. For her, her grandson's recovery should not be a process of small gestures and amateur photographs, but a serious and costly medical intervention. "Arthur, we need to be rational," she said, sitting in the living room, her posture impeccable, her voice calm and controlled. The same voice that had convinced him to isolate himself in his grief years ago. "This environment isn't ideal for Leo. He needs specialists, a clinical structure. I've found an institution in Switzerland, the best in the world. It's the only logical path." The word logical was the weapon she had always used against him, appealing to the businessman, the financier who was supposed to make decisions based on data, not feelings. Clara, who was bringing in a tray of water, overheard the conversation from the doorway. A chill ran down her spine. The idea of Leo being sent away to a cold, impersonal clinic, torn from the only home he knew, seemed a cruelty beyond measure. Moved by a protective impulse stronger than any sense of hierarchy, she intervened. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Leo is making progress. He's reconnecting, finding joy. He needs love, not a hospital." The look Veronica gave her was one of pure disdain, as if an inanimate object had dared to speak. "And who are you to have an opinion?" "The nanny," she retorted, her voice dripping with venom. "You are overstepping every boundary of your position." She then turned to Arthur, the final blow prepared. "Are you going to allow an employee to dictate the future of your son, my grandson? Be the man you once were, Arthur. Make the correct decision, a leader's decision, not that of a sentimental father." The pressure was crushing. On one side, Clara's pleading gaze. On the other, Veronica's cold logic. which echoed his own fears and guilt. He was a man trained to cut his losses, to make tough calls in his business. And in that moment, in an act of weakness disguised as strength, he caved once again. "Veronica is right," he said, his voice hoarse, avoiding Clara's eyes. "The arrangements will be made." The sentence was passed. Veronica, victorious, then turned to Clara with an icy smile. "And as for you, I believe your services are no longer required. Your involvement has become inappropriate. You're fired." The words fell like hammer blows in the silence of the room. Leo, who had been watching from the hallway door, let out a choked cry of despair. Seeing Clara turn to leave, her eyes filled with tears, he rolled his chair to the photo collage they had built on the wall and, in a gesture of fury and pain, began to rip down every single picture. The sound of tearing paper echoed through the mansion like a final, irrevocable goodbye. Clara's departure was a desolate event, executed with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. Mrs. Gable supervised the packing of her few belongings, her face a mask of contained satisfaction, while Arthur locked himself in his office, deaf to the silent pleas of his own conscience. The only witness to the farewell was Leo, who watched from his bedroom window, his face stained with tears. As the woman who had given him back the light walked across the stone courtyard and disappeared through the iron gate, the mansion plunged back into its primordial silence. But this time, it was different. It was a haunted silence, full of echoes and ghosts. The torn pieces of photographs had been cleaned up, the wall was bare, but the absence of the images was more eloquent than their presence had ever been. It was a void that screamed the story of a stolen joy. In the days that followed, Leo became unreachable, erecting emotional walls that not even Arthur could breach. He refused to eat, spent hours staring at the empty wall, and answered all attempts at conversation with a stubborn mutism. Veronica and Mrs. Gable's victory proved to be a Pyrrhic one. They had restored order, but at the cost of the house's soul. Arthur felt the weight of his decision in every corner. The scent of apple spice cake had vanished from the kitchen. The sound of laughter no longer echoed in the garden, and the sunlight, which now streamed freely through the open windows, seemed cold and sterile. He had made the logical choice, the one a multimillionaire would make to optimize an outcome. But the profit was a grim peace and a heartbroken son. Guilt was compound interest, growing exponentially with every silent hour. One night, unable to sleep, he went down to the kitchen for a glass of water. The moonlight shone through the window, illuminating the refrigerator door. The small magnet was still there, a lone reminder of what had been lost. It was then that he saw something on the floor, partially hidden under the baseboard of a cabinet. A small square of paper that had escaped the merciless cleanup. He bent down and picked it up. It was one of the photos, not the one from the refrigerator, but another one he had never seen up close. The picture taken on that first day, the miracle he had witnessed from the garden. The image showed Leo's face bathed in sunlight, his eyes closed, the serene smile of someone surrendering to a moment of pure bliss. It was the image of peace. He turned the photo over, and on the back, a delicate, firm handwriting had inscribed a short sentence. "Life requires courage. 2. Those 5 words hit him with the force of a revelation. It wasn't an accusation, but a mirror. He, Arthur Monroe, the man who faced the volatility of the stock market, who risked millions on daring investments, lacked the most basic courage of all, the courage to feel, to fight for what truly mattered, to protect his own son's happiness. The sentence haunted him for the rest of the night, echoing in the silence of his mind. Courage. He had traded his son's joy for Veronica's approval. He had sacrificed the woman who brought healing in the name of cold, corporate logic. He had hidden behind his net worth, using money as a shield against life. The sound of tearing paper, which he had heard from his office, now made sense. It wasn't just the sound of photos being destroyed, it was the sound of his own soul breaking apart. At dawn, something inside him shifted. The fog of guilt and fear began to dissipate, replaced by a cutting clarity and a determination he hadn't felt in years. He picked up the phone and called Veronica. The conversation was short and final. Leo was not going to Switzerland. Leo was staying home. The decision, for the first time, was not based on logic or fear, but on love. Next, he summoned Mrs. Gable to his study. He thanked her for her years of service, handed her a generous severance that reflected a tiny fraction of his fortune, and dismissed her. The old order was broken. Now the hardest task remained. He needed to find the woman who had brought color back to his house. He didn't know where she lived, didn't have her number. He had only a name and one last hope. He had to find her, not just to fix what he had broken, but because he realized, with a certainty that shook him to his bones, that his own healing depended on her. The search for Clara proved more difficult than Arthur imagined. He, a man whose contacts could locate any asset or person in the business world, felt powerless. The employment agency that had placed her had an old address, and the phone number was disconnected. For days, he drove aimlessly through the boroughs of New York, a city he knew only from the top of its skyscrapers, feeling like a foreigner in his own territory. The mansion, now free of Mrs. Gable's oppressive presence, seemed even emptier. It was just him and Leo, two castaways on an island of luxury, relearning how to talk, how to look each other in the eye. Arthur had told his son about his decisions, about firing Mrs. Gable and cancelling the trip. Leo listened in silence, and though he didn't smile, a small flame of hope seemed to rekindle in his eyes. The clue that led him to her came from an unexpected place, Clara's old blog. In one of the posts, she had spoken fondly of a community center in her neighborhood, a place where she had learned her first guitar chords and where volunteers taught classes for the kids. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. On a Saturday afternoon, he drove his luxury sedan to a part of the city his GPS rarely mapped. He crossed a bridge into the Bronx, where the streets were narrower, the buildings more colorful, and life pulsed on the sidewalks in a way that Greenwich, Connecticut, never would. He found the community center, a simple but well-kept building from whose open windows came a cacophony of children's laughter and music. He parked the car, feeling the curious stares of the residents. The contrast between his world and this one was stark, a collision of social and economic realities. For a moment, he hesitated. What was he doing here? What would he say if he found her? But the image of Leo's photo, with the sentence on the back, gave him the strength he needed. He went inside. The place was buzzing with activity. Children were running everywhere, and the smell of fresh paint and cornbread hung in the air. And then, in the back of a room with walls covered in drawings, he saw her. She was kneeling on the floor, just as she had been the first day he saw her, surrounded by a group of fascinated children. In her hands were not her old camera, but several disposable ones. She was teaching them about light and shadow, about finding beauty in the simplest things. Her face was serene, focused, and she smiled with a genuineness that made Arthur's heart ache. There, in that environment of simplicity and infectious joy, he understood. He understood what she had always meant with her gestures, her photos, her refusal of his money. Living wasn't about accumulating assets or shielding yourself from pain. It was about seeing again, about having the courage to connect, to find the light, even in the darkest places. She didn't need his wealth. She possessed a wealth of her own, a net worth of resilience and love that he was only beginning to comprehend. He stood in the doorway, watching her, the billionaire feeling like the poorest of men. Clara, sensing a gaze on her, looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded room. The surprise on her face was quickly replaced by a more complex emotion, a mixture of old hurt and cautious curiosity. The noise around them seemed to fade away, and for a long moment there was only the silence between the two worlds colliding in that doorway. He took a step forward, his heart in his throat, knowing that the next few words could define the rest of his life and his son's. "Clara," he said, his voice sounding more vulnerable than it ever had, I need help. We need you." Arthur's words hung in the air, cutting through the children's cheerful noise. Clara stared at him, her heart thudding. Seeing him there, so out of place in his expensive suit amidst the vibrant simplicity of the community center, was surreal. The words he'd said, "We need you," were the last thing she ever expected to hear. It wasn't a formal apology, not a job offer, but a confession of vulnerability, a plea. The children around her, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, grew quiet, looking from the serious man's face to their teacher's stunned one. Clara stood slowly, wiping her hands on her jeans. She walked toward him, and they moved to a more private corner of the courtyard, under the shade of a maple tree. He told her everything. About the conversation with Veronica, about firing Mrs. Gable, about the days of silence and the photo he'd found on the kitchen floor. He spoke with a raw sincerity, stripped of the armor of control he always wore. He didn't try to justify his actions. He simply laid them bare, owning the totality of his weakness and his regret. "I spent years building an empire, measuring my life in profit and net worth," he said, his voice low, his eyes locked on hers. "And you, with an old camera and a huge heart, showed me just how bankrupt I was. I didn't have the courage you wrote about on that photo. I was a coward, and my son paid the price." Clara listened in silence, her heart softening with every word. The anger and hurt she had felt began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of compassion. She saw before her not the arrogant millionaire, but a broken man, fighting to find his way back. "This isn't about coming back to work for me," he continued, guessing her thoughts. "It's about building something new. Together, Leo needs you. But the truth is, I need you too. I need you to teach me how to see again." The invitation was more than a proposal. It was a supplication. Clara thought of her life, of her deferred dream, of the sense of belonging she had found in this community center. But she also thought of Leo, of the smile they had built together and which had been so brutally undone. And as much as she tried to deny it, she thought of him, the man whose pain she was beginning to understand. She knew that returning to that mansion would be a risk, a gamble with a high emotional return, but also high potential for more suffering. But the line from the photo, her own life philosophy, now turned back on her. Life required courage, too. "I'll come back," she said, finally, "but on one condition. I won't just be the nanny anymore. We'll be partners in Leo's recovery, and in everything that comes after." The relief on Arthur's face was so profound and visible, it seemed to lift a physical weight from his shoulders. Clara's return to the mansion was not a return to the past, but the beginning of a new chapter. The rules were rewritten, not with authority, but with collaboration. The idea of a photography exhibition emerged naturally, as a way to celebrate Leo's progress and give purpose to his new way of seeing the world. They spent the following weeks immersed in the project, which they called Eyes Wide Open. Arthur, using his influence and resources not to show off but to support, organized the event in a small, charming art gallery in Soho. The night of the exhibition was the climax of their journey. The place was filled with friends, a few of Arthur's business contacts, and the children and families from the community center. The walls displayed Leo's photos, the sun on the window pane, the bark of a tree, the smile of a friend, as well as some of Clara's own work. Leo, in his wheelchair, radiated a quiet confidence, explaining his photos to the guests. The peak of the evening came when Arthur was called to say a few words. He stepped onto the small stage, but instead of speaking, he pointed to a photo that was covered on an easel. Leo unveiled it. It was a recent picture. taken by him. An image of Arthur standing in the garden, looking toward the horizon with a genuine smile. The first one Leo had managed to capture. Below it, in the boy's own handwriting, the caption read, "Dad, she taught me how to live again. Now you teach her how to stay." The silence that followed the unveiling of the photo and its caption was absolute. Every pair of eyes in the gallery turned to Arthur on the stage, and then to Clara, who stood beside Leo, her face suddenly flushed. The buzz of conversation, the clinking of glasses, all of it faded, leaving only the power of those words floating in the air. Leo's declaration was so direct, so disarmingly honest, that it transcended childish innocence and became a universal truth, understood by everyone present. It was a request, a blessing, and a challenge, all in one sentence. Arthur looked at the photo of himself, at that smile he barely recognized, and then at his son, whose eyes shone with a wisdom far beyond his years. Finally, his eyes found Clara's. In that instant, all remaining barriers of class, of past, of pain, dissolved completely. He stepped down from the small stage, the microphone forgotten, and walked through the crowd, which parted for him like the sea. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Before everyone, before the world he had built and the new world she had shown him, Arthur reached out and took Clara's hand. The gesture was simple, public, and unequivocal. It was not the hesitant touch from the stormy night, but a firm grasp, full of purpose and promise. Her hand, small and warm, fit into his as if it had always belonged there. He gently pulled her closer, and with his other hand, he touched Leo's shoulder, uniting the three of them in the center of this universe they had rebuilt together. A tentative applause started in a corner of the gallery and quickly spread, a warm, genuine sound, celebrating not a closed deal or a record profited, but a triumph of the heart. That simple, powerful gesture was the rewriting of three lives' destinies. The story didn't end with a cinematic kiss or a passionate declaration of love. It ended with something more real and much stronger, the beginning of a new normal. In the weeks that followed, the mansion in Greenwich ceased to be a mausoleum and became a home. The doors to the music room were opened, and although Helen's piano still remained silent, a guitar now rested in a corner, and its clumsy chords, played by Arthur with Clara's help, often filled the house. Photography remained the primary language of this newly formed family, a way to document the small miracles of everyday life. Arthur discovered that the greatest investment he could make wasn't on the stock exchange, but in time spent with those he loved. He learned to laugh at himself, to find joy in a walk in the park, to understand that true wealth was not in his possessions, but in his human connections. Clara, in turn, found her place. She enrolled in the photography program, not as a gift, but as part of a partnership, a life project they were building together. She never lost her resilient sweetness, but it was now tempered with a new confidence, the certainty that she belonged there, not out of charity, but by right, earned through love and courage. The final image of the narrative was not captured by any lens, but was etched in the soul. A golden afternoon, much like the first. Sunlight spilled into the now perpetually open garage. Leo was between them, no longer a broken boy, but a young artist finding his voice. Clara's old camera rested on the floor, its work done. And Arthur, his arm around her shoulders, looked at his son and at the future, his face finally at peace. A new family portrait was being created, one that didn't need to be hung on a wall, because it lived and breathed in every laugh, every touch, every shared glance. It was a story about how light, when it finds a crack, has the power to flood the deepest darkness, a story of courage that became love.